Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Ducks Confidential podcast. As always, I'm James Crepea, joined by Ryan Clarke, as we start a new football season. It has been a moment since we've been with you, so we appreciate and hope everybody that had a very good summer and a bit of relaxation away from all things sports, but particularly away from football. And we are now jumping very much back into it with both feet, as the Big Ten era at Oregon is upon us. We will certainly get into that, along with the Duck making his road tour across the league, which is quite amusing, among many other things that have gone on throughout the summer and ahead of this preseason from the recruiting side of things, as that has obviously picked up significantly since last we spoke, but that's normal for the summertime in particular, and get into a little bit of preseason camp, which Oregon enters its second calendar week, though wrapping up the first week in terms of sheer number of days, getting into full pads and the like. And we'll start viewing some practices here this week, but going on what we heard from the various media days, catching up with nearly half the team at the team media day, obviously Big Ten media days, and all the talk with NIL and all that stuff. We'll get into that around some of the recruiting stuff. But Ryan, again, looking forward to what should be certainly a pretty hyped up season at the very least, and one with where we know the expectations are as high as they've ever been for Oregon, who opens up as the preseason coaches poll comes out this morning at number 3, the highest for the Ducks since 2013. It really doesn't get much higher than that when you're behind only Georgia and Ohio State heading into the season. That's the rare air that this program has been not just yearning to get back to and aspiring for, but that what Dan Lanning and his staff have been building towards. And again, for credit where it is due, to where Mario Cristobal was building towards when he was here as well, and had certainly achieved some success. But Lanning and staff have taken it to that level, and they enter the season, like I say, preseason number 3, and the coaches will find out next week for the AP poll. Expectations are as high as it gets.
Yeah, it may be the biggest expectations, as you said, that this program has had in its history. Just given the hype, given the work that they did in the transfer portal to build out this roster, given the talk around Dan Lanning as a program builder, a motivator, everything that people have talked about with him, all of the off-season speculation with Alabama that swirled around him that he seems, frankly, sick of talking about and being asked about, having to sort of reiterate his loyalty to Oregon through the off-season. He's locked into this program and doing the work necessary to put them in position to contend for a national championship, be it the way he's built this roster, the work they're doing on the road in terms of recruiting with the current highest per player average in terms of rating in 247 right now, even if their class is a little bit smaller than the rest of the blue bloods in college football. But preseason number 3 in coaches poll, best, as you said, since 2013, probably going to be in the same area in the AP poll. Massive expectations for this season. Obviously, the big dates circled, Ohio State at home. That's got potential to be the biggest college football game of the year, period. Not just for the Ducks or the Buckeyes. On the road at Michigan, that's going to be a major moment in program history to go on the road at the national champions, even with everything swirling around that program that might make things even more difficult for Sharon Moore and company this season. This Oregon team, we had the opportunity, obviously, to speak to a great many players at that media day, and obviously we're thankful to the folks at the U of O athletic department for bringing out that volume of players, because it's great to meet so many of them. But you look at them, you watch them walk in, and you're like, oh, there's a former 5-star, there's a former highly rated 4-star recruit, there's a guy who had a lot of success at another program and has come in to play a key role for the Ducks, be it a Dylan Gabriel or a Jabbar Muhammad. The sheer volume of talent, and you could probably speak to this more than I could given your years on this beat, but the sheer volume of talent walking through that door, I think objectively is remarkable. Beyond obviously the quality of the coaching and of the program in general, just these individual players and across positions, it's remarkable.
Yeah, and virtually every position group year over year, nearly everyone. I mean, again, you could kind of quibble in a few spots for sure, but The areas where they were weak, they went out and improved, particularly in the secondary. That was the biggest glaring weakness. And that is why they lost the 2 games they lost. I mean, calling it what it is. And yes, they were facing an unbelievable Washington offense with first-round quarterback, first-round receiver, et cetera, but you can counter that, and they couldn't. They have now stocked that position accordingly, not just for one opponent, the likes of Ohio State, for example, but anybody, particularly if you're going to make a playoff run, you're going to have to play. If you're going to follow the model that's there for how to win a national championship. Yes, Michigan last year was a bit of an exception to the rule insofar as it was more of a traditional running team, although still had a first-round quarterback, but nevertheless was a running team. Outside of them, if you're going to play and win a national championship, you are probably going to have to go through one or multiple, and in all likelihood multiple, teams who are built like, you name it, Georgia, LSU, Alabama, Ohio State. Heck, in a given year, you might have to go through all of those teams, depending on how the playoff falls. They're not playing with 3 tight ends on the field. They're playing with 3 first and second round wide receivers on the field, and you need secondaries to counter that. They went and addressed that. But if you go throughout the rest of the groups, we'll obviously see how quarterback shakes out and what Dylan Gabriel looks like relative to Bo Nix, and obviously you don't just assume that someone's going to be better than somebody who just broke the accuracy record for the NCAA, but be that as it may, comparing numbers is the least of it. Gabriel surrounded with more skill weapons than he's ever had before. This offensive line is on paper, and based off what we know from what's returning, shapes up to be as good or better than any offensive line he's been behind. And he had a couple of good ones. He did. Last year at Oklahoma, they were not bad. So that's why I say it could certainly be comparable to, but surrounded with more talent. And then defensively, like I've already mentioned the secondary, but yeah, they lost a lot of bodies on the interior defensive line, and some of those guys went undrafted, but got undrafted free agent contracts, and Dorless did get drafted. And yes, having said that, the glut of this defensive line and edge group is younger players, but the guys who they added, particularly in Derek Harmon and Jamari Caldwell at defensive tackle, are examples where, and yes, this is a product of the portal era. Let's call it what it is. I mean, they are transfers. You can't really compare it historically speaking, because historically speaking, you couldn't pluck 2 guys like that. Maybe you could get a quote unquote grad transfer or something for 1 year, but trying to get a junior was not viable, where they'd have to sit out a year historically. The size of these 2 defensive tackles that they added is so enormous, not just in relative terms, but compared to Oregon historically, even compared to the guys who were just here. You don't have any defensive lineman, let alone interior defensive lineman. You don't have players like this at Oregon. You just don't.
Yeah, the players look different, and I think that they are built in such a way that regardless of whether there was this change in conference and the realignment and moving to a run-heavy Big Ten, as was part of the discussion at Media Day, either way, these are the type of dudes, physically and experience-wise and skill-wise, that allow you to not only fill those holes, but to potentially improve, like you said, at that position, and to be a physical defense that is capable of competing with the major college football programs in Ohio State, Georgia, et cetera.
Yeah, you're going to have, like I say, this everything about winning now is harder. Winning in the Big Ten is going to be harder than winning in the Pac-12 was. Winning in the postseason, and certainly ever winning a national championship, is harder in a 12-team format than it was in a 4-team format. And before that, the 2-team BCS. Yeah. So in order to achieve those things, you cannot have, and I don't think any team, forget about Oregon, I don't think any program will have the sorts of years outside of where there's a coaching change. Washington's dealing with it right now. But outside of a coaching change where a team gets rated and it's harder to reload and et cetera, I don't think it's a program that makes it to a national championship or wins a national championship and has the stability at coach will have the situation that LSU had after winning in 19, where they had so many players go to the league, and because that was earlier in the portal era, and because when you lose that many players, some expected, some unexpected, all of a sudden you're left with a fair, not totally barren cupboard, but you're left with major holes. Now in this world, between NIL transfer and everything else, I don't think you're going to see that anymore. And now if we get to 105-man rosters next season, I really don't think you're ever going to see that, because it's going to allow for a greater, stocking and restocking along the way, to where, look, Oregon's got 22 seniors, scholarship seniors, on its roster. Closer to 25 in terms of who will actually play when you factor in specialists and other guys who are in different capacities. That's a ton on an 85-man roster. That is a lot. That is more than either of the past 2 seasons. They had 14 last year. Well, albeit with 27 juniors, but those juniors moved up, some moved out, and they added to it to where they've got, like I say, call it for round number purposes, and like I say, because of roles and what they'll actually play, call it about 25 players. That's what I think is going to become the model of particularly as we get to 105-man rosters. It'll probably be even more than that. You're going to have not just starting lineups, you're going to have 2 deeps littered with upperclassmen, and when underclassmen break through in the future, they're going to have to be prodigies. And they borderline on that now at certain positions, like a Penei-Sewell-like player on the offensive line in particular. But at certain spots, either a team is going to have to have been so mismanaged to where a freshman has to play by default, particularly a quarterback or something, or they are an absolute prodigy, like I mentioned, a Penei-Sewell, or you're hearing about what now with Jeremiah Smith at Ohio State, to where he's not just going to be a starter, he might be the number 1 receiver, which at that place is saying something. So again, if you're an absolute freak, perhaps you can break through that early. But with the rosters of the future, I think what Oregon has done is going to be, and they're not the only ones, but this is going to be the model going forward insofar as how to build in order to win in the new Big Ten, the new SEC, and then contend with the likes of those teams, perhaps 4 of them in a 5-week span or 6-week span in the postseason to win a national championship. I don't know how a team who doesn't have certainly double digits at minimum, probably north of a dozen seniors in a given year, and with a 105-man roster, probably north of 20. I don't know how one of those teams is going. How are you going to win 4 games against the likes of, if you're pick any SEC team, you have to have potentially played for or competed for an SEC championship against the likes of Alabama, Georgia, LSU, in good years, Auburn, perhaps Florida, again, in good years. And then you're going to have to potentially play any and all of them, maybe multiple of them, again, in a playoff. And then, when you get to the playoff, you could have Oregon, USC, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, maybe Wisconsin in an oddball year. Oh, I neglected to mention Texas or Oklahoma in the SEC also, now that they've joined. How are you going to play 4 of those teams? We're not even looking past the ACC and the Big 12. Just rattling off the ones who are in the Big 2 leagues right now. How are you going to win 4 games if you don't have home field advantage, or even 3 games in the playoff era? No, if you don't have an absolute stacked roster of experienced players who are really big, really talented, who are just bigger.
Yeah, just bigger, and the biggest thing that you touched on being the experience and the depth of experience on a roster, right? Oregon has constructed this year's roster to absolutely fit that model, and you would expect, given the way that they have been active not only on the recruiting trail but the transfer portal, that their future 105-man rosters are going to be built in a similar fashion. That's important for multiple reasons. That's important for the fact that you no longer have to, even though it is harder to make that multiple, several game run through the playoff, especially if you don't win your conference, you don't have to walk on that tightrope anymore that the Ducks and other programs used to, where you lose the one big game and suddenly you're on the edge or out of the playoff entirely. But if you do lose that game, if things don't fall your way, let's say on the road at Michigan or at home against Ohio State or in the Big Ten championship against an Ohio State or Michigan, you no longer are in a position where that completely ends your chances, and therefore building your roster out in such a way that you have that depth, you have that experience, you have the ability to, regardless of how many injuries you might endure, have talent behind those individuals that's ready to step up. You still have an opportunity to win a national championship. You give yourself as many potential bites out of the apple in the coming years as you possibly can. Maybe you're a 5 seed in the playoff, you host a game and you make a run from there. Maybe you win the Big Ten this year if you're Oregon and you have a top 4 seed and you only have to have that shorter quote unquote run to a national championship. But either way, you're constructed in such a way that you can continue to contend for that. And I think that the other layer of the 105-man roster change that you touched on a bit, but it is something that we can examine and look at in the coming years, is how it impacts roster retention. Because Dan Lanning and others have spoken a lot about how, yeah, the transfer portal is great, but at the end of the day, what you do in high school recruiting is the most important thing, because even if you lose a few of those guys to the portal or they flip or whatever, you still have built out the future of your roster, the depth and talent of your roster in an important way. And with those expanded rosters, perhaps there will be less incentive for younger guys to move on to another program when they see the opportunity for development within the program that they're in, when they see these opportunities to get into more, snaps and opportunities and everything else as the seasons and years go along. And if they feel taken care of, not just from an NIL perspective, but from, a program perspective and a personal development perspective, all that stuff matters. And I think that there's a lot of craziness swirling around college football in terms of transfers and recruiting and NIL. But if you construct your program the way that I think Dan Lanning and company are constructing this one, you're going to be able to weather that storm, embrace the chaos in some ways and go grab guys out in the recruiting realm and in the portal, but also find a way to create stability out of chaos, which I don't think every major college football program is going to be able to do necessarily.
Yeah, again, there's going to be certainly fascinating to see how everybody goes about managing this and handling this. You've seen, obviously, certain programs, Oregon being among them so far, but Georgia and Ohio State also, I would say. Historically speaking, I would have mentioned Bama, but they had greater churn this year because of the coaching change. Where, yes, they've had whatever degree of churn they've had, but they've largely still managed to hold on to not just the major returning players that they had, truly critical, major contributing starters. The most critical outgoing departure from Oregon under Lanning has been Cam McCormick. Not only because of his sheer volume of years and many years that will probably go unmatched for the rest of program history, but because, look, you can, in terms of statistics, was he the biggest contributor? No. But in terms of the role that he played in blocking and to what he could have done had he come back, because, call what it is, Cam McCormick is a better blocking tight end, better player than Casey Kelly was. And Casey Kelly spent 1 year here. So, no, calling it what it is, that's the most significant outgoing departure. But in terms of what they've brought in, they've obviously enhanced the roster each year at every which position. We mentioned whether it be the secondary or the defensive line this year. Obviously a quarterback. Yes, but a lot of these going forward, and you can, just as I mentioned to folks who have the scholarship chart and the breakdown of that bookmarked accordingly, I went ahead and added two, and I keep it up to date all the time for the current roster. But I went ahead and if you scroll down, you can find the on paper, extremely early look at what Oregon looks like on paper for next season. And I say extremely early for myriad reasons, not only about transfers in or out, neither of which I'm projecting, but also about we don't know anything about 105 yet, and 105 still has to be settled by the courts, but that's what has been agreed to thus far. Whether or not it gets finalized will obviously move around. But on paper today, just as we're wrapping up this part of the conversation, Oregon has 80 players, scholarship players on paper as of today for 2025. If you're going to get to 105, and that's a big if, by the way, But if you're going to get to 105 scholarship players a year from now, if you think that's going to be 25 more freshmen, I can assure you it will not be. So they're going to have to bring in transfers as they always do. But they're going to probably have to bring in a fairly significant number of them if the roster limit does indeed get approved to 105 for next year and they're hitting it. They will probably be scattering those across upperclassmen, and that's just the way it's going to be. But
yeah, I was going to say too that this isn't EA Sports College Football 25. You're not going to get 30 recruits coming in as freshmen, as you may be capable of doing in a dynasty mode, if you play as a recruiting oriented coach for the Oregon Ducks. Which, man, the difference, just as a quick aside before we get to other serious topics, the difference between doing a rebuild as I did of Arizona State versus just doing a build of the Oregon Ducks is pretty remarkable in that game, just for the resources alone. But
yes, it is a fun. It's fun that the game's back. It's great that the game's back. Obviously, the players, as you can imagine, are elated to be in it, and that's part of
Gary Bryant did the paperwork now, so he's good.
Everybody, it sounds like everybody's done the paper. Well, the returning players, everyone's done the paper. Sounded like I'm still not entirely sure on Amari Washington. I was trying to follow the logic. I'm sure he'll get there eventually. Now, in terms of the true freshmen who aren't included in it, we haven't spoken to them and won't. But be that as it may, I'm sure many of them will also get in it. And ultimately, in the long run, I'm sure virtually everybody on the team will be there eventually. But for those who are, obviously, pretty cool, to say the least. For college players, that's the reality now. And yeah, the game's pretty fun. So we're not going to get into it on a constant, but because of obviously that, yes, historically, this is, it is a significant moment. And it's a big deal given that the game was away for 10 years. Yeah, pretty cool deal. That's part of it. And like, as you mentioned, yes, Oregon is built a certain kind of way in the game as well. That's pretty fun. But to the team of the here and now and this season ahead, what were your... We're not going to go through, certainly we talked to 44 players at Media Day, so we're not going to go over all of them. But what were some of your takeaways between Big Ten Media Day and Team Media Day, Ryan, in terms of just what we'd heard? Obviously, we haven't seen anything just yet at practice because practice has been closed this far, but that's about to change this week. But from what you heard, from what you took away from the various player interviews, and from what you heard from Lanning, for that matter.
Yeah, I think that I think you can tell that not only Lanning but the players as well are pretty ready to start to prove this stuff on the field in general. Especially a guy like Lanning, who he has been a really charismatic and interesting person for people to view in the media, but you can tell that he is tired of talking about it. He's tired. He's the type of guy coming through the Saban coaching tree and working directly for Kirby Smart and seeing how those programs talk with their pads, quote unquote. You can tell he is definitely ready to start doing that rather than continuing to build on the hype, which, of course, we in the media have a role to play in terms of examining the hype and talking about the hype and everything else. But you can tell he's definitely ready to go past that. In terms of the players, I think that a universally adopted mindset seems strong with this group. I mean, it's not just a ragtag group of individuals who are sort of out for this, that, or the other, personal opportunity or draft stock or NIL opportunities or whatever. I mean, these are guys that seem by and large genuinely bought in to the vision for the program and the opportunity to win a national championship. Really, strong heads on the shoulders of guys that have a tremendous amount of talent to begin with, and I think that bodes well for Oregon this season in terms of their success on the field. I am interested too in the personalities that are on this team on both sides of the ball. I think there are people with really interesting and compelling personal stories and journeys to this point. We've seen human moments from these people, including obviously Dylan Gabriel, whose dog passed away about a week and a half or so ago prior to Media Day, and he was very emotional talking about that. So I think that the human element and the opportunity to get to know these individuals this season is something that I personally, as a writer and reporter, am excited about. But just in terms of what we've heard from this team, from these coaches, from these players, it's a business-like mindset, and it's something that is not necessarily guaranteed in this crazy world of college football that we have right now. But what is being displayed, at least publicly, by this group is an attention to detail and business-like approach that I think bodes well for the Ducks on the field.
I think what you heard from multiple transfers is what it kind of stuck out to me was, and transfers who were the couple of truly new transfers who just got here, and Brandon Johnson and Derek Harmon, but also the transfers who showed up mid-year in January and spent a couple of months, went through spring practice. The tone that they were referring to, and that when they were saying that, so why, so especially for Harmon and Johnson, who, like I say, arrived in the summer, it was their first time talking to them, and a couple of guys asking, naturally, so why Oregon for you, and multiple players, them specifically, but beyond them, Kobe Savage as well, and a few others, saying how it's different here. Okay, well, what does that mean? Can you expound on that? And you're hearing it from guys who've only been here for a month and a half, maybe month and a half of calendar time, and even in that time, I think there was a week or so where everybody was allowed to go home and cut away before camp opened. And you're hearing about how it's different because of what the standard is. It's different because of what the approach is. It's different because of how the players are conducting things in summer workouts, and where the goals are and how people are aligned is different. Now, anybody who comes into a new place is going to say it's different than their last place. But when you're hearing that from more experienced players, when you're hearing that from a player in Brandon Johnson, who frankly, look, Duke was a good team last year. Good enough to where its head coach got an SEC job. So they've been around. They've been around some success too. And to say nothing of, all right, Michigan State may not have been very good last year and had all kinds of tumultuous stuff going on. But, Mel Tucker did come from the Saban tree too. So certain things by way of standards or strength and conditioning and the like, and Harmon mentioned that, like, some of the weight program stuff is very similar because of that. But otherwise, that there is a heightened standard and way of going about things here. I think that's come across stronger this summer, this time. I wouldn't just say compared to last year. No, it came off pretty well last year, don't get me wrong. But to your point, all right, sometimes it's totally out of player control or program control in terms of some of the stuff we talk about or ask about or anything like that. That they have nothing to do with that. But like 2 years ago, the amount of conversation about, calling it what it is, the amount of conversation about Justin Flo when he hadn't played, and then it just became about caricature. Nothing had happened yet. So the amount of questions and conversation and stories written about a player who didn't play, and then when he didn't play particularly well, and then isn't here anymore. All right, on one hand, hey, it's a former five-star guy. Of course we're going to be asking about him, no doubt. But that was 2 years ago. We're not asking, and I'm not faulting anybody. This is part of the job, part of the conversation. The point is, we're not asking about guys who aren't playing. We're not asking about guys who are just hyped up, but, well, they're not on the field. Like, this roster, like we talked to at the beginning, this roster is built a certain kind of way to where if we're asking about it, we're talking about it, we're writing about, these guys are all contributors now. We're not messing around with projections or speculation or recruiting rankings. This has all been proven to a point, and again, it's been built to that. So I think that level of substance certainly came through and resonated, like I say, from some of the more experienced players, particularly two of the more recent transfers. And again, we already alluded to and mentioned, obviously, some of the size of these guys, which is just, again, bigger than in certain spots, historically speaking, or whatever the case may be. So a lot of that kind of stuck out. Otherwise, in terms of the sheer totality of it, far more at Big Ten Media Day than at that Team Media Day, certainly. But it was one of the many conversations leading up to it in the offseason, talking season. Look, all this NIL-related stuff, and this is what will segue into some of the recruiting bit, all this NIL conversation. and how Oregon has been tagged with it for whatever reason more than any other program right now. We saw it a couple of years ago with A&M, so you can't say more than anyone ever. That's not true. But how and why it's been attached to this program in this particular recruiting class more than others. I understand that historically Oregon wasn't a top 3 or top 5 recruiter every year. But being in the top 10 or being in the top 5 is not unusual since Mario Cristobal got here. Dan Lanning and his staff, when they were hired, the label that was thrown on them was that they were a recruiting first staff. That was literally how they were referred to. So now in year 3 and cycle 3 or cycle 4 of recruiting, now they're seeing the fruits of that labor, and now it's a problem. Now they're doing it. They're not actually recruiting. They're doing it this other. I mean, everybody wants to have it through the narrative, through the way that they want to present it.
Yeah, I think that there's these perceptions that exist with Oregon that are bleeding into this discussion about NIL, and I think, frankly, it's unfair to Oregon. It's unfair to Dan Lanning. It's unfair to the program generally to have them viewed as sort of, oh, well, you know, they're not doing it the proper way. They're just sort of, you know, asking Uncle Phil for money to pay these recruits an exorbitant amount of NIL, and they're just sweeping the recruiting trail, when in fact they're not sweeping the recruiting trail by any stretch of the imagination. They've had success in the transfer portal, and they have absolutely, you know, backed up the Brinks truck for those guys. Let's not, you know, mince words there. Dylan Gabriel got a payday. Evan Stewart got a payday. We don't know those numbers, and we probably will never know those numbers.
You hear some numbers thrown around. You hear some numbers thrown around. But again, we're not going to offer conjecture. If you know it, you know it. I mean, if you absolutely have it nailed down and it's fact, well, then we go ahead and report it. But have there been some reporting to what some of those numbers may or may not be? They're significant, but that's what the marketplace bears.
It is, and if it were the case where they had this sort of unlimited NIL, which has been unfortunately the narrative that's been grabbed onto, and I think you know, addressed rightfully by Jerry Neuheisel in the aftermath of those commentaries. If that were truly the case, they would be blowing everybody out of the water, or they would be at or near the top of every major recruiting rankings more comfortably, I think, than they currently are. They are still having guys flip. They are still losing out on major recruits that they are pursuing. They are on a level playing field with everybody else, and I think that the quote that Dan gave Tyson Alger, our friend at the I-5 corridor, a couple of weeks ago, talking about the rabbit has a gun now, I think is a pretty fair assessment, even though it is obviously coming from Lanning's perspective, and he's biased with this situation. But I think it's fair. I think that Oregon is now, not just because of Phil Knight, but because of the way that they have built their program out and their recruiting apparatus out, they are competing on the same level as the historic blue bloods in Georgia and Alabama and Michigan and the like, Ohio State, of course. And that predates Lanning too. Let's not, you know, pretend that Dan Lanning showed up and saved the day with Oregon. Mario Cristobal, for all the challenges his teams had on the field and winning the big games and the like, he was an excellent recruiter.
He won too. I mean, that's overblown too. I'm sorry. Like, I don't mean to cut off, but I mean, call what it is. People are ticked off about game management and timeout management. After that, get over it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, like, I mean, come on. I mean, you know, and to say nothing, and how, Justin Herbert wasn't fully, I want to go back down the history, but like that criticism, that trope is so overblown. I hate, again, especially now with the benefit of time, go back and look at the rosters. Go back and look at what he inherited. Go back and look at how he had 63 scholarship players in 2018. Go back and look at what receivers Justin Herbert was supposed to be throwing to in 2018 and 2019, and then say, oh, well, if the era existed today and how they would have gone about it. Come on now. I mean, some of that. So like I say, hey, the in-game management, the loss to Stanford at home in 18, where that play never should have been run, the loss in 21, where there were circumstances that made it a very, very, very chaotic situation. But nevertheless, they lost the game. No. The Utah losses at the end of that year. Again, you want to look back historically? Anybody? To go take a look at the rosters and tell me how Oregon was supposed to win that game. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the point of course being that, like, you know, as a recruiter, Cristobal did a great job. I think that you can go back into Chip Kelly's eras and Mike Bellotti and everything else and see the, you know, the foundation of this program being built to the point that it is now with those individuals. So the narrative that exists that, you know, Dan Lanning and Phil Knight got together and decided, all right, now that we can pay players, we'll just do whatever the heck we want and the rest of college football can try to catch up. That's not even true. And Oregon isn't even ahead in that department. You got to remember that these programs in Georgia, in Alabama, Michigan, and the like, they have very wealthy boosters and individuals, maybe not as wealthy individually as Phil Knight, but might be putting up similar or bigger numbers of money for these sort of, you know, NIL focused recruiting efforts that Knight is. And they made their money in a number of different ways that we don't need to necessarily get into on the podcast, but
there's so many boosters that drill into everybody's.
Yeah, worthy of questioning for sure. But regardless, the point being that this narrative swirling around Oregon, I think is just a continuation of Oregon being just viewed as Nike University, of Oregon being viewed as something that's inauthentic or not backed up by the substance, you know. But Lanning's little viral thing about, you know, we're not playing for clicks, we're playing for wins, I think is genuinely their approach. I don't think he's just, you know, blowing smoke in that way. I think that they have genuinely built out a program in the model of the most successful programs in the country, and that, more than anything, is the reason why they are now on a level playing field in terms of recruiting.
Yeah, and again, this is what the marketplace bears. Like you said, they wouldn't be losing a couple of guys. They wouldn't lose commitments, or they wouldn't lose battles at certain positions where, frankly, they're going to have to attack in all kinds of different ways. I mentioned the portal. Like, if they had unlimited NIL, they wouldn't have lost that at linebacker the way they have, to where they're going to have to, they have no choice right now, in all likelihood, but to go to the portal potentially for multiple players, because it's just not a particularly deep position in this recruiting class in terms of what's left out there. And they're probably going to have to go a different direction, or they wouldn't have lost a couple of commitments that they lost relatively recently. Now, that said, they may end up flipping a couple of guys from other places back their way in the future, whatever. But to your point, I think calling it what it is, I think largely that criticism is lobbed by those at fans and those connected to programs that have achieved greater success historically. And what does that success look like? Usually comes with a crystal ball. And they lie to themselves about how and why they may have gotten their most recent crystal ball or two. And because they may have had one historically, and I say historically, maybe let's say one before the most recent one or two, I don't know, I'm just going to pick a year. Let's call it 1980. Because they may have had a trophy in the trophy case before, or they're geographically in a state with more talent, they think, well, naturally, anybody who chooses to come here and play here is because we are this school, we are this program.
Yeah, we have this tradition. We're superior because of
whatever
it.
It is.
Yeah.
Whatever it is. And okay, well, and again, they can lie to themselves about how they achieved the most recent scale of success, and that's fine and well and good. Point is I think that those criticisms are coming from those who have that greater volume of historic winning, or even more recent, certainly national championships, which is always the thing that's been used against Oregon. And they already know, you already know that when the day comes that Oregon does win a title, that the number one thing is going to be, well, they bought it. You already know it. No matter what the roster looks like, you know that that's going to be the thing.
Exactly. So that's absolutely going to be a narrative, but if that is the what ends up happening.
But be that as it may, that's for, again, that feeds into and leads into the recruiting conversation, which is where we'll wrap up this week's of the podcast, is because, yes, a lot has happened in that realm since last we spoke and held the podcast, but obviously a lot of the summer recruiting, a lot of movement, commitments, and the like. We're not going to go through all of them and all the moves, but the bottom line, giving a synopsis of where Oregon finds itself here at the start of August, and particularly after the most recent commitment for that matter, and where things are shaping up for this class that, yes, very well could be historic for, and I feel like I've been saying this for the last 5-6 years now, could be a historic class for program history, but yes, could be a historic class for program history, but in any number of ways. Before, it was always in gross ranking or in gross recruiting points in the 247 Sports Composite. This has a chance to be historic for those and volume of 5 stars and average per player and you name it. Blue chip ratio. This could be historic in any number of ways for the program, but give us a kind of just overview and synopses of where the Ducks find themselves on paper on the recruiting trail at this point, right?
Yeah, it's already historic, frankly, when you look at a guy like DeCorian Moore, number 1 wide receiver in the country, committing from Duncanville, Texas. He's a guy that has a higher composite rating on 247 than Kayvon Thibodeau did, and that means he's the number 1 rated, at least by 247's metric, recruit in Oregon history. So already history made there with his commitment, and obviously the most recent commitment of Trey McNutt, the other composite 5-star player for the Ducks, a safety who brings a lot to the table for Oregon. Those two guys obviously highlighting this growing class, which is hovering in the range of about 15 players at this point. Could get down to 14 in the coming days if a decommitment happens here, but maybe right back up to 15 with a lineman that could potentially commit this week to Oregon. Overall, though, you take a look at this class, you think about the quality of players, as you said, the potential for history on a number of fronts. But right now, despite having a smaller class in terms of volume than some of its competitors that are in the top 5, Oregon, of course, ranked 6th in the 247 rankings. The per player average is the highest in the country, and that is a BFD regardless of what your class size ends up being, that you are bringing in this caliber of talent to Oregon, and potentially having the most talented in terms of those ratings class in program history. That is significant. I think that the Ducks will get closer to their competitors in terms of the number of players as this cycle continues to move along. But in general, you look at the quality of players across positions on both sides of the ball. It's spread very evenly. It's highly. They recruited very well, particularly at the wide receiver position in terms of volume. But there's a guy at a lot of the major and important positions that you're like, okay, that's a blue chip guy or a highly rated 4-star or a potentially underrated 3-star
class is blue chips.
I mean, pretty much all of them are blue chips. Yeah, 1 3-star at this point. So this is a very impressive recruiting class and effort by Dan Lanning and company. I think that we're gonna talk to Rashad Samples on Monday here. This is of course the day we're recording the podcast. So tonight he'll be available for the media. The addition of him and of others on the staff in terms of their recruiting prowess and the connections that they have, you can't discount that, especially when it comes to getting more across the line, when it comes to the running backs that they've recruited in this and in future classes, obviously 2026, starting to build out in its own way with the addition of Jonas Williams, the quarterback, and Tredarian Ball, the 4-star running back. But look, the work that's been done in these last few months, it has been the number one thing I've paid attention to, and the number one thing that has caught my eye about what's going on with this program with no games to play or talk about, is the level of work that they're doing on that recruiting trail. It is genuinely impressive, and they have an opportunity to have a top 5 class, or even a top 3 class if things go their way. It's been remarkable.
Yeah, and look, the job's not finished. For one, not just in terms of they actually have to sign everybody and hold on to everybody, but they got to add. They got to add to it. There's still holes here in this class. I mean, look, they had a tight end. They got to get one, and that's one specifically. They probably have to add to the offensive. Not probably. I think they have to add to the offensive line. At least one more. They have to add to the interior defensive line. And I mentioned linebacker before, but yeah, they have to. And the problem with that position is there's just not a lot of bodies left out there to be had. So unless you're going to flip somebody, which is certainly viable, you're probably going to have to go to the portal there because that's just a position that's not particularly deep in this year's recruiting class. They just landed McNutt at safety. They may or may not feel the need to have to add beyond that because, like I say, you can take a look on paper as to how some of these position groups are setting up for 25, and yeah, they are thin at a couple of positions: tight end, inside backer, potentially at safety, depending on how things break. Yeah, they're probably going to have to add. And again, they could add experience, and everybody could say, go get a transfer. Yeah, but you don't know what the transfer market looks like yet. You have no idea.
Yeah, there's no guarantees in that, and so that adds to the importance, as Lanning has said previously and others in the program have repeated, is the importance of building out a robust class in that way. And yeah, they absolutely, for that reason, have a lot more work to do. Yeah.
With the way that they've added at using safety just as an example specifically, on paper, because they're losing 3 seniors after this year, you cannot assume with the 6 players that are on paper to be back next year, you can't begin to assume what the market looks like. And on top of that, you have a roster where you're going to have Aaron Flowers, Kingston Lopa, Peyton Woodyard, and Trey McNutt all in either their first year, McNutt's case, or second year in the other 3 players' case. You want to bring in, you have to add to the room. And yes, Tyler Turner and Kamari Terrell are also in that capacity, although Terrell's been playing more outside corner recently. But be that as it may, it even further underscores the need at safety. Whether it's 4, 5, 6 returning players, regardless, all of those guys are blue chips. All of those guys are probably going to play. The 3 freshmen who are here now are probably going to play this season. It's tough to try to get an experienced player who, 1, is better, and 2, whether they're better or not, now you want them to, especially if they're not better, now you want them to play behind freshmen or sophomores and convince them that that's, oh, hey, come in, but be just a role guy. You're shopping in a different area of the marketplace when you do something like that. And I'm not saying it's impossible. That's harder to do. And call it what it is. And the transfers that they've brought in the last couple of years, with limited exception, very few have been role guys. Very few. There have been a couple. Caleb Chapman, they were taking a flyer on. They were hoping he'd be healthy. He wasn't. Okay, it happens. Again, I mentioned Case Killett before. He was going to be in that role. Okay. Nashad Strother on the offensive line was expected to compete for a starting job. Got hurt at the end of last fall camp. And okay, he's on the 2 deep. Was on the 2 deep. Is on the 2 deep. And then Junior Angela, who came in hurt, and that's unfortunately just the way it was for him, where he came in coming off an injury and was trying to give it a go, but just simply could not get back to the level that he was before that. Outside of that, all the other transfers they brought in were major contributors, major players. So you're going to try and do that. I'm using the safety position as an example because of the way the room is now currently stacked with there's so much youth. Trying to do that at certain spots is going to become a lot harder with the way they are recruiting, which is a good thing, a good problem to have. But when you're in the position of, okay, but where else and how else are you going to fill the room but for transfers, it's going to be a tough thing to navigate. It's going to be harder. So that's why, yes, trying to go about it through the high school ranks, not just is optimal and more in your control, but in certain positions where even when it starts to get thin, yeah, it becomes imperative to find and know certain answers because, as I say, trying to add to a position that is starting to get stacked the way it is with an experienced player who you're asking to come in and perhaps not be a starter, that is a tough and tight rope to walk. Not impossible, but more difficult compared to if you are that player entering your 4th or 5th year and final year of eligibility and, you can be a role player on that team who is a playoff caliber team, may have won a championship, whatever. I'm not just talking about Oregon here, talking about anybody. Or you can absolutely be a starter if you go to this fringe top 15 team who's trying to get in. That's going to be what that marketplace is going to be looking like. That's hard. Like I say, that's hard to navigate. That's going to be hard to do because there are going to be programs out there who aspire for and are trying to get into, whether it be the playoff or whatever the case may be, at G5 level teams even, who are going to be offering more by way of playing time to those caliber players than you are. And the answer to everything can't simply be NIL because for exactly that, because if they're offering a starting capacity, their NIL is going to be pretty good. And if you're offering a backup role, I don't think you're going to be breaking the bank. And again,
and that's why you have to
any team, any program.
Exactly. That's why you have to sell development. That's why you have to sell, program stability, coach stability. You got to, have all of these things in place beyond just big, hefty NIL coffers to build your program out in this way. And it starts day one, bottom of the pyramid is this high school recruiting. So more work for them to do, but the work done so far, I think, has been genuinely impressive.
Agreed. Well, we'll certainly get into that more in the months ahead as the class continues to get filled out. But in the days and weeks ahead, certainly, folks will check out Oregon Live as they can and should, and I hope already have been for some time, for all of our day-to-day daily content surrounding fall camp over the next several weeks leading into the season. And, of course, the season opener against Idaho. But very much lots and lots and lots to come. And then our next edition of the podcast, we'll be able to get into much more of what we see on the field, albeit in the limited time that we do get. But we'll at least be able to see some things beyond just hearing from folks and hearing from the coaching staff and many players along the way so far. We'll be able to give greater context in terms of what we see in terms of some personnel groups or the like, to at least be able to discern a little bit of where some things stack in and stand at this point, as like I say, as Oregon shifts into now full padded practices and gets that much closer to and approaches the season opener. So again, be sure to like, subscribe, 5-star review, all those things for the podcast. Make sure to check out OregonLive.com on a constant basis, as the sheer volume of stories, both in terms of the here and now and fall camp, recruiting, looking ahead to the season, you name it, has picked up exponentially, as you might imagine. Now that talking season is over and fall camp is upon us, Ryan and I and others have been producing quite a bit. So make sure to check out all of our stuff. Make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast so you get it in your feed and the like. And we'll be back and see you next week.